Welcome to the Original Gangsters podcast. I'm your host, Scott Burnstein. I'm very, very, very excited to bring on one of my original partners in crime, the original partner in crime for the Scott Burnstein True Crime brand, Mr. Al Prophet, who's joining us from California.
Gang signs.
And we're going to discuss the Kennedy family and the Mafia. We are at the 60-year anniversary of the JFK assassination.
Oh, that's why it's so hot. Okay.
Yeah, Al didn't understand why I wanted to touch on this subject right now. For me, everyone kind of assumes that the mob and the Mafia is something that I've been interested in my whole life, and it really isn't. But in terms of the first piece of what you would call true crime that really fascinated me was the JFK assassination. I remember as a young boy watching the Martin Sheen TV movie with Martin Sheen playing JFK.
Was this pre or post bar mitzvah?
This was pre-bar mitzvah. This was like,
wow.
I'm thinking this was when I was in elementary school.
You were a boy, not yet a man.
Right, 7, 8, 9 years old. I remember going to the library and
But it was after your bris.
Yes, go in and reading as much as I could. So it's a subject that I've always been interested in. Let's just jump in. Al, did the Mafia murder JFK? It's a complicated question.
So Scott and I did Killing Jimmy Hoffa. I mean, I kind of did it. Scott was heavy, did a lot of work consulting. Boy, something interesting I found in studying various of these huge criminal cases, when there's so much information, it becomes sort of no information. It's like trying to learn, like, what's really going on in Gaza right now? Well, there's so much stuff. It's like there's no information, right? There's so much misleading, contradictory. Each piece of evidence, you need to know its heritage, right? I mean, where did this piece of evidence come? As you know, you study things, you find out that, this basic tenet of a case that, the killer had on a red shirt. Well, you trace that back far enough and you find out, some guy that was at the scene when the first reporter came said he had a red shirt, and that was just an alcoholic who hangs out on that corner. It might not mean anything, right? So to answer your question directly, if God, someone who actually knows, if God was going to pay off and you gave me 50-50 odds, I'd say they were involved.
Yeah. It's one of those things where it's just like, obviously you're probably—
It's Carlos Marx, but here's my chief piece of evidence that you can't refute, or that I just find to be too much of a coincidence. Jack Ruby talked on the phone in the day or two in between Kennedy's assassination and him assassinating Lee Harvey Oswald with guys from the Teamsters who were linked to being people that did homicides, enforcement.
There's no question Jack Ruby was incredibly mob.
Well, he talked to Teamsters on the phone, and he was connected to the Marcello mob. And the Teamsters he called—
and the Chicago mob, and
the Teamster he called was a guy, forget the guy's name, but he specifically was somebody, it wasn't Frank Sheeran, it's somebody else implicated in some homicides. It wasn't someone—
Barney Bake, I think.
Barney, there you go. And who wasn't someone he normally talked to on the phone. He was a hitter, and Ruby was connected through Chicago to Carlos Marcello down there, who had control over Dallas. And he was friendly with the Chicago police. And how a guy with a gun just roams into the police station, I don't see how you get past that. And then Ruby gets cancer and dies. And as we've seen from Vladimir Putin, And as was admitted in the church committee hearings in 74, poisoning people, giving them stuff to cause cancer. I mean, that's something that Putin has done. And the church committee admitted trying with
That's
Castro,
what they were
which
trying to
means
do, right?
maybe they did it with somebody else.
Well, so and you can trace the relationship between the Italian mafia in America and the CIA, all the way back to World War II.
So in doing Cold War Hero and Heat, one of my documentaries, American Dope, Cold War Hero and Heat, all streaming platforms.
Yes.
It was interesting to find out that the BNDD, Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, which was shut down by Richard Nixon of all people for corruption, which shows how corrupt they were, forerunner to then it was replaced by the DEA. So when that was created at the end of World War II, well, I mean, that existed, already. And when World War II ended and the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, got turned into the CIA, the people that trained the OSS agents, who at that point had experience in being in wartime, now they had to work in peacetime and infiltrate foreign countries. They were trained by narcotics detective, Bureau of Narcotics people. So their first contacts in these foreign countries were criminals, often international narcotics smugglers. And circling around, why was the BNDD closed down for corruption by Nixon? Well, amongst other things, the most shocking of it was a scandal called the informant murders, where and these records are still sealed. There were congressional hearings that at least we know of publicly, I think like 28, which means there was probably a lot more. These BNDD agents, the people who trained the CIA agents, were killing each other's informants. So if I'm a BNDD agent and I got a snitch and he's telling on Scott is a BNDD agent. He's protecting a member of the Genovese family. My guy is snitching to me about Scott, while your agent comes and kills my snitch. So these guys were killing each other's snitches because they were telling on each other's corrupt benefactors.
And you had a situation where, starting from after World War II or during World War II, to past the Kennedy assassination, but definitely, through that time period leading up to it and during it, the CIA and the Mafia had common
it
interests, and
even
them an opportunity to work together. I mean,
well documented.
Yeah.
In the first elections after World War II in France and Italy, the Communist Party running, not some secret thing, but in a democratic election, the Communist Party and very left-wing socialists were looking like they were going to do very well in the election. They, amongst other people, did not want to accept the Marshall Plan because they knew that would bring Western Europe into a very tight economic co-prosperity sphere, to use a Japanese phrase, with the United States. They were going to vote against it. The communists were going to do well. And the CIA, there's CIA agents interviewed about this in documentaries on PBS. This is no secret. Were paying people that were organized crime to, bust up strikes. Well, best way to bust up a strike is to kill the strike leaders. So absolutely. There were, and of course, the deal with Lucky Luciano on the docks.
Yeah,
that happened.
And then and then you go to the Kennedy administration, or I guess before the Kennedy administration, was it
Eisenhower?
Eisenhower, but what was it? New Year's Day 59 or New Year's Day 60?
In Havana, 59.
So New Year's Day 59, Castro unseats Batista in the Cuban Revolution,
and immediately the intrigue starts.
Right, and you have the Mafia, who was, they had bought and paid for Batista.
Cuba was their, that was their retirement, that was their IRA, that was their. We built the empire crime in the United States. Cuba was going to be their legal,
They had
our
all their
own island.
a ton of money there, spent a lot of time there, controlled the government.
Guys are going to be able to move there. Like that was the mafia's retirement plan.
Right, and they've been building it since Prohibition, and then Castro puts a wrench into all of it. The CIA, America is in the middle of a Cold War, so you had the mafia wanting to get Castro out of there and go get their money back.
$1,000,000%.
Right. So there's already these seeds planted before the
the CIA's old friend, Lucky Luciano. Well, the U.S. government's old friend, Lucky Luciano. Remember, he gets out of prison. They deport him to Italy. He can't come to the U.S. So in 1947, he has that drug traffickers conference basically there in Cuba, where they set up the first post-war international heroin smuggling thing. And of course, there was a different one set up in Detroit in the 50s, but the Luciano one was one of the, where that was when they specifically said, we're going to target black neighbor, we're going to do Harlem first, and blah, blah, blah. And so, yeah, the ties, and this is all totally documented. None of this
well documented.
Yeah, beyond well documented. This is out of PBS, New York Times, out of the horse's mouth of CIA agents. And this stuff happened.
And the church committee, just read the
report. Yeah, I mean, but right,
and the mid '70s committee reports.
And people under oath, CIA agents and other government officials under oath were like, "Yeah, that happened. We did that."
Well, let's talk about the Kennedy family. I know you've done some research into Joe Kennedy, who was the patriarch, the one who started what we know as the modern day Kennedy dynasty. So
his father was a little bit of somebody too, but
and then he married into the kind of political royalty out of Boston.
Yeah, I think the mayor's daughter, maybe.
Mayor's daughter, right? But tell the viewers and listeners, where Joe Kennedy kind of made some of his money. It wasn't all legitimate.
Well, okay, so I think a lot of people are familiar with he was involved in bootlegging,
right?
So, but that's I think known. So let's tell our audience some other stuff. So he did a bunch of things on Wall Street that weren't illegal when he did them, but he was one of the people that caused a new set of laws to be passed. He was one of the people that created the pump and dump. Right. So I buy a bunch of stock, I put out false news that causes the stock price to go up or down and make a bunch of money, which is, gets you put in federal prison now. So now all those type of guys do it with cryptocurrency, which is the biggest organized crime moneymaker in history, but that's another story. So he made a bunch of money on that. And then so let me tell you one good story of show you type of guy he was. And once again, this is poisoning assassination a la Jack Ruby. So anyone who's been to L.A. and Hollywood.
I was going to say, tell the Pantages Theater.
Yeah. So anyone who's been to L.A. and Hollywood and the tourist area, there's something called the Pantages Theater. I've been there. I saw Aladdin, the musical Aladdin. It's like the Fox Theater in Detroit, or one of those theaters built in 1910, beautiful, restored, but it's always been active. Well, the Pantages, when it was built, it was a movie theater, and there was a chain of them owned by a Greek immigrant named Pantages. So after Joseph Kennedy left Wall Street and bootlegging ended, because it was like the early 30s and liquor was legal, he was very rich at this point, and he was made the head of MCM movie production. And at that time, it was not a violation of antitrust for movie production company to own theaters. So he wanted to own the Pantages, which was a large theater chain around, I don't know, the whole country or large parts of the country. Pantages didn't want to sell. So Pantages is sitting in his office one day there on Hollywood Boulevard. 17-year-old girl comes in. "Oh, I'd like to see Mr. Pantages. I have an appointment." The secretary sends him in. She immediately, after a minute or two, comes running out of his office with her clothes torn. He RAP'd me. So Pantages is a Greek immigrant. This is the 30s. If you're an immigrant, your chances of justice not as good. Plus, a young girl saying somebody R.A.P'd her. Well, we weren't used to that in Hollywood yet. Big scandal. Pantages gets found guilty. He gets 50 years in prison. While he's in prison, of course, the value of the theater tanks. Joseph Kennedy swoops in, buys the whole chain for pennies on the dollar of what he would have had to pay for it. But the case was so hinky that the judge, I don't know how long Pantages sat in prison, wasn't too long. A year, 3, 10 months. I'm not sure. Long enough for Kennedy to get the chain. But the judge calls it back in and is like, no, this ain't right. And he overturns the verdict, because if you didn't know, judges can do that. Jury can't overturn a judge's verdict, but a judge can say, no, not to find you guilty, but a judge can remove a guilty verdict.
Right. And declare a mistrial. And
so that's what he did. But the girl ends up saying, well, actually, I have an older boyfriend, a pimp, and he put me up to it. I just went in there, tore my clothes, ran out. It was all a lie. And then she gave an interview where she said, Joseph Kennedy paid me and my boyfriend to do it. As soon as she gives that, she falls. Mind you, she's at 18 at this point. She falls ill with some weird cancer or something, and dies in a week, as if she were poisoned.
Well, we know that Joe Kennedy
Kennedy made he benefited tremendously, and of course MCM is who Ronald Reagan ended up being an actor for, and you the strike breaker. He helped. He was very anti-union in Hollywood. Yeah. Teamsters had a grip in Hollywood. It's all intertwined.
And Joe Kennedy, from a very early
big bootlegger, while he was the ambassador to England.
Right. Well, I was going to say, before he reaches the point where he gets into American politics and is given an ambassadorship, very valuable ambassadorship at that point to Great Britain,
second biggest economy in the world.
Yeah, and he brings the whole family over there. He has 10 kids, and he has his eyes on his end game is to get one of his sons in the White House. I mean, this isn't something that.
Ironic. By the time that happened, though, didn't he? He had when did he have his stroke?
Well, no, that's okay. I'm going to get to that in a second. So,
it's God's hand.
I was going to say, I've always said, and I'm going to jump ahead and then go backwards, that if Joe Kennedy doesn't have his stroke that Al just referenced, and he had it in 61, shortly after John is sworn in.
Okay, he was in his right mind to see his victory.
Yes. But shortly thereafter, he has his stroke.
What's weird, though, is, you think you're one of the richest people in the country. You're very powerful. Who cares? It's nice. It's your son being the president is great. But
what I'm saying,
I guess I'm not a power-hungry person. But
what I'm saying is Joe was his son's fixer and his son's backroom wheeler dealer.
Oh, right. So his protection goes away, or his Cardinal Richelieu goes away.
And you had, two things happen, one leading to the other. Or I guess one leading to the other, Kennedy wins the election. We can talk about whether or not it was on the up and up. It was one of the closest elections in American history.
They're all, my thing on that is probably the shadiness equals out on both sides.
Yeah, there was rumors that the Chicago mob and the Detroit mob and some guys in other parts
of the
country.
But Republicans were stopping black people from voting in the South. So, it all kind of probably equals out.
Some election integrity issues, I guess, in Illinois, and then in
West Virginia,
which the Detroit guys allegedly had.
And it's funny, there was a lot of mob activity. There's a lot of coal mining scandal stuff.
Then there was.
Dan Moldea made his bone. That was his first big case, I think.
Well, and Dan Moldea wrote Dark Victory, which was the story of Ronald Reagan and the Mafia and all that stuff.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah. Shout out to Dan Moldea. How's he doing?
He's doing all right. We had him on to talk Hoffa a couple weeks ago. So he's an OG, man. He's pushing into his mid 70s now, I think. But where we go with the Kennedys is, I've always said, if Joe Kennedy doesn't have that stroke, who knows what happens? Because
that's very astute on your part. I didn't think of that. Yeah, because he was he had all the connections.
Two things happen. So you have the stroke that Joe Kennedy is felled by in 61. He doesn't kill him, but he becomes kind of a vegetable to a degree. At that point,
according to Robert Kennedy Jr., the crazy person who thinks he should be president, his grandfather could only communicate through grunts.
And at this point, it looks like all bets are off with any relationship between the Kennedys and the nefarious figures that might have or might not have helped them get into office. And at this point, Bobby Kennedy goes full court press mode as Attorney General after all these guys that, in their mind, at least, they felt like they had bought a presidency with the help of Joe Sr. Bobby starts.
Bobby was on another page.
Right, Bobby starts going after him because he sees it as good for his political future.
Those Kefauver and was there another hearing? I mean, those
McClellan
and Kefauver. I mean, those really were insidious. I mean, it showed it insidious
on national television at that.
Though there was a hype element to it, but there was a real element too. I mean, and some of those old school gangsters, and not just the Italian guys, it's all those people were pretty sinister on national TV.
So the two questions I would have would be, if Joe Kennedy was of sane mind, does Bobby Kennedy get let loose? Could John F. Kennedy take the leash off and say, go after these guys? And the answer is probably no.
Joe would have had some type of.
And then Joe would have smoothed. And then even if it did get off the ground, Joe would have would he have smoothed it over?
It would have. It definitely wouldn't have been as bad. Like, even if it went forward, it wouldn't have been as bad. He would have figured out some middle ground. Bravo.
It's also interesting to point out, I think, for, again, being a kind of a Kennedy aficionado, I don't know if people realize, is that John F. Kennedy was not the golden boy at first. He was not the chosen one. He was looked at as kind of a defective Kennedy. He was very sickly, was not what his brother Joe Jr. was.
Who was killed.
So Joe Jr. was the one that was like the all-American 4-point student quarterback of the Harvard football team. As good looking as John F. Kennedy was, Joe Kennedy was better looking.
He was the Al Prophet of the family.
He could have been a movie star. He was a star athlete.
And he was tragically shot. What, his airplane shot down?
Well, so this is an interesting story. I want to tell that. I don't know a lot of people know.
I don't know it.
So the story is that, again, one was clearly the favorite son in Joe Jr.
How much older was he?
4 or 5 years.
The Irish pop them out all in a row.
And people don't know, Joe Sr. was very, very against us getting into World War II. He was a Nazi sympathizer.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty bizarre.
Right. Didn't want us to get into World War II. But when Pearl Harbor happens and we're attacked by the Japanese and we're drawn in to World War II, then it becomes advantageous for Joe Sr. to have his sons go to war and become war heroes. The impression was that Joe Sr. was going to go and win the Purple Heart and come home and run for office.
Could he have kept them out of the war?
Would what?
Could he have kept them out of the war?
I mean, I think his opinion, Joe Sr.'s opinion, up until 41, was one of the main reasons that we stayed out of the war.
No, could he have kept his sons out of the war?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yes, he could have kept his sons out of the war. But he wanted them to go and they wanted to go. So going into it, if you were going to...
Well, they woun't have been able to run for all if they would have been ducked the war. Yeah.
But if there were the betting odds, you would say that Joe was going to go be a hero and John was going to go and kind of, blend into the background. Well, they both go off to war. John is in the South Pacific. Joe is like in what is today like Delta Force, like as top of the line.
Was he he wasn't a pilot?
He was. No, he was. So, but what's interesting is they both go to war in the first year or two of the war. Joe doesn't see a lot of action. I think he's training, getting, like this top level clearance. John becomes a war hero, kind of surprisingly, I think, to his own family, because he had been so sickly. But
did anyone ever think there was anything fake about JFK's heroism?
Probably. I'm sure.
Because his book was fake. He had a ghostwriter write his book. Right.
So he comes home after being awarded a Medal of Valor for saving people in the South Pacific. It's his dad's 50th birthday party. They're at
we're about to be 50.
Right, that's crazy.
We're supposed to have war hero sons about to be president. Jesus Christ!
So
what have we done with our lives?
They're on Martha's Vineyard, and they're celebrating his 50th birthday party, and he is for the first time in the history of the Kennedy family, he is more smitten with Jack than he is Joe. And according to the story, I'm sure there's some mythology involved in this. He toasts Jack Kennedy at the party, and Joe leaves the room and is fuming that his brother got a Bronze Star or a Purple Heart before he did. At that point, he volunteers for a mission that is like as dangerous can be.
What year was this?
44. And knowing that if I do this, I will now upstage.
Yeah, because those air raids, it was like 50-50 where you're going to come back.
It was to dump a bunch of explosives into Nazi military points.
Yeah, those were like those guys were here. Those guys were pretty heroic because it was 50-50 where you're going to come back.
So he goes. And within months of this party. His dad's 50th birthday party, Joe, I believe, passes away in tragic fashion as a war hero. His ejection seat doesn't work. He can't eject out, and the plane blows up with him in it.
Oh, like he dive bomb a plane, eject out. Oh, wow.
Right. At that point, now John is number one son, and now it's his. It's for him to become president. But for all this time up until that point, Jack was an afterthought.
Boy, so that's all. To psychologize it, either their competitiveness was such that he wanted to one-up them, and then there was probably also a fatal,
Yeah.
That's a child hurts his parent the most. That's, a lot of times with suicide.
Yeah.
People will leave a note, hey, Mom, great job raising me, So, boy, that's dark.
Yeah, and then
So it wasn't in part of his, nor he had completed his tour, and specifically after his brother was feted as a war hero, he said, hey, I'm going to go back and do the most high-risk thing there is.
Yeah, the most dangerous possible, most heroic possible thing I can volunteer for. And that's the end of Joe Kennedy. One of the things that begins what they call the Kennedy curse with a lot of the sons and grandsons and nephews and grandnephews meeting and daughters meeting pretty horrific.
Shout out to Rosemary.
Yeah. And then the other daughter, she was lobotomized, and then the other daughter died in a plane crash with her husband, who was like royalty of some sort.
Prince Rain. No.
Yeah, the Kathleen, I believe, the daughter Kathleen.
Was she with the Prince of Monaco, or that was somebody else?
She was married to a prince of some country, and they died in a plane crash. But John becomes president. Jack becomes president. He's only what to me is something that I find noteworthy for someone that the mythology is just as
1,000 days.
He was not president for that long.
1,000 days, right?
About 2.5 years.
Yeah, it's like 1,000 days, they say. Yeah.
And it seems like, not that you can ever, predict these things, but that people knew going into Dallas at that time period was probably a little bit more dangerous than going into other major cities. Would you say that's true?
Okay, so to go back to originally did the mob kill him. So in these conspiracies, and I think here a good conspiracy, because to me it seems very clear cut to show a person how this would work. Now, the Kennedy thing was much more complicated. Malcolm X. So if you're Elijah Muhammad and you want Malcolm X dead, you have an organization, and certainly not all the people in the Nation of Islam then joined in prison, and certainly not everybody was violent, but you had a fair amount of people who he helped, people that were drug addicts in maximum security prison who turned their life around, who were fanatically loved Elijah Muhammad and were rough guys. So if you put a drawing, which they did, on the front of the page, or the cover of the Final Call, with Malcolm X's head bouncing down the steps, calling him an infidel, well, there's a high chance that some 1 or 2 or 3 of these violent followers you have in some city at some opportunity are going to kill him, and no such thing as a tacit conspiracy. He never has to assign anybody to do anything to Malcolm X. He figured it would eventually happen. So to go to your point of Dallas, if you know that there's this bubbling cauldron of Cubans who want the Kennedys, they're upset about the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Kennedy at this point is hands off with we're not going to mess with Cuba. That was too embarrassing. We want a new president who's going to aggressively push Castro. And then you got the mob upset at him.
Yeah, Vietnam, which is in the early stages.
A variety of reasons, from we're not getting what we wanted from our what we paid for, but more so than that, his brother, and then of course Marcello getting deported.
Hoffa hated him. I mean, Jimmy Hoffa despised.
RFK. I mean, I have a whole chapter of that in the Killing Jimmy Hoffa. I mean, these guys are having push-up contests against each other, like in the basement of the courthouse. Like, they detested each other.
And when JFK died, Jimmy Hoffa,
he refused to raise the flag, to bring it to half-mast.
Standing order for all Teamsters locals around the country to not put their flag at half-mast.
That's unheard of.
Yeah.
So, that whole, and we don't see in movies about the South and the mob, but
Trafficante.
Listen, in 1960, the FBI's write-up on the mob, and of course it's imperfect, but one report listed Marcello as possibly the most powerful single mafioso. Him and Trafficante weren't answerable to the commission.
Right. They had
and so people know Tampa and New Orleans are actually the 2 oldest mafia places. Italian immigrants went to those 2 places even before New York because the climate was similar, and there was incidents in New Orleans
in the 1800s.
In 1889 or something, didn't they rushed to jail and hung a bunch of Sicilians? Like, stuff was going on down there long before New York, like 30 years before New York.
And even though there hasn't been a mafia in Texas in quite a long time, there was a mafia in Dallas.
And they were, and even if there's not made men, there are people that are.
Guys. Joe Civillo was the Don. He was a guy that had respect around the country. I mean,
and they were answerable. They were under Marcello's sway. Marcello had a lot of power.
Yeah.
Marcello and Trafficante had a lot of power. They had the drugs coming in. They were away from everybody else. The South was poorer and probably more like Sicily in the sense of weaker government, easier to corrupt.
Yeah, and Jack Ruby was a Midwestern guy. His real name was Jack Rubenstein.
Chicago transplant.
From Chicago, had spent some time in Detroit, went down to Dallas. His brother Earl Ruby.
Where I went to elementary school, Earl Ruby Cleaners was there on between 6 and 7 on Livernois between 6 and 7. I walk past that every day.
Yeah. He moved down to Dallas and was tied into all these guys. And then let's talk about Lee Harvey Oswald. We've left his name out of this, but whatever you want to believe about him and connections to the mafia, which I think you can find, there's no question in my mind.
He was an agent. He was definitely an agent of the U.S. Whether witting or unwitting.
Yeah.
Well, and that's when I go back to the Malcolm X example of where you can create if I want Scott killed, if I orchestrate the kind of people that don't like Scott to be around him, or I let Scott be around them, or I let a situation kind of, hey, there's a rumor that Scott told on somebody in Detroit, and I don't put out the fire. I let that spread through Detroit, and I don't tell Scott, and I start, hey, Scott, you should hang out in Detroit more. Well, eventually, maybe you're going to be somewhere where someone does something to you. I don't have to set up a conspiracy. I create a dangerous situation and let you be there.
Plant seeds and cultivate those seeds for them to grow themselves.
And that way there's no crack, there's no trail. But Oswald, you ever read Norman Mailer's book, Oswald's Tale?
He defected to Russia.
And then came back, and then it
with no problem. Well,
there's
in the middle of the height of the Cold War.
It's absurd.
Right.
It's absurd.
And then there's video of him,
Mexico City.
There's tapes of him in Mexico City. There's other tapes of him in the French Quarter in New Orleans, doing some
leafleting. I have the footage in Killing Jimmy. Go watch Killing Jimmy Off. I got the footage of him passing out anti-Castro leaflets.
Yeah.
But where he was supposed to be pro-Castro if he was communist. So, but that brings you back to crazy, like Lee Harvey Oswald was certainly someone that wanted to be important.
Yeah.
And it's only luck that Oswald even came. See, I don't think they expected Oswald to make it to custody, because remember, he shot that cop.
Yeah.
And the idea that you assassinate the president and that you would think a guy like that is not going to get taken into custody probably. And then as your backup, you're like, oh shit, we got to get him killed. And they have Ruby do it. Lee Harvey Oswald is totally fascinating character. I would suggest anyone interested in this to read Norman Mailer's very long but well-researched nonfiction book. It's called Oswald's Tale.
Yeah.
And he interviews Oswald's handlers, this former KGB in Russia. But again, Oswald's Tale itself as just a sub part of the Kennedy thing, there's so much information, your head swims and you just don't know what to make of any of it. I mean,
he brought back a Russian bride.
He wasn't someone that was directly like, hey, he met the CIA at a diner and they said kill Kennedy. I mean, he was a flake and there's no smoking gun. So whatever was being done with him was, I just think it was this. There were people that wanted Kennedy dead, and there was, yes, but parts of the government, and then people throw around the word the government as if the government's so gigantic. Me and you in our area can have a plan that someone else is not in on, and the perfect storm happened, and they had basically. Remember, this is the same time when U.S. soldiers were coming back from North Korea that had been effectively brainwashed, the Manchurian Candidate. I mean, hypnosis is a certain amount of people are very susceptible to hypnosis, to deep. Not everybody's susceptible to this, but there's people you could put deep hypnotic implant into it and turn them on. All this stuff is real. It doesn't work on everybody, but if you got 20 Oswalds floating around. All you need is for one of them to be in the right place at the right time and for it to happen. Now, is there some real specific, this guy and this guy met up and said, we're going to kill him this day and had these people do it? That's hard to really...
It's hard to prove. It's almost impossible.
Yeah, there's all this evidence that something was going on. That's why I'm left with the idea that it's sort of like, I want to kill Scott. It ain't something I think.
Leave a bunch of
it's not something I think about every day. And I get a call. Scott is drunk in an alley in Detroit, urinating at 3 a.m. because he secretly is a fucking crackhead. And I'm like, oh shit, we'll shoot him in the head. It's quite a scenario I just made up, but you know what I'm saying? Yeah. Some weird opportunity presents itself.
Well, and frankly, them guys, logistically,
they didn't have any security. He's just guy in a fucking rappers have more security than Kennedy did then.
That's what I'm saying. Talk logistically. Like, was this Oswald shooting from the book depository, or were there multiple shooters? I've never really.
I find it hard that there would be several other guys with rifles who fired them, and there's no sightings, there's no evidence, there's nothing on film other than that vague, those bums getting rounded up or whatever that was. I think it was, there weren't people on a grassy knoll, I don't think. Could there have been the fact that the bullet supposedly, all the movements of the bullet is pretty ridiculous. You know, the bullet would have 5 entry and exit wounds or something. I think there was another shooter probably in a building.
And I think it's
Oswald, they knew somebody knew, because Oswald, people don't know, Oswald shot that general. Did you know about that?
Yeah.
Oswald shot, he didn't kill him. He tried to assassinate a real right-wing. See, and that's another thing when Oswald, 1 minute because he did shoot this racist right-wing general, but then you want to kill the liberal Kennedy. Oswald, I think, was just a flake who wanted to be important, that they knew could be maneuvered into being up in the depository, but there was one or two other professional shooters in a building somewhere who did, maybe Oswald's bullet hit him too, but who were there to really do it. And Oswald was the fall guy, like he said.
But I mean, to your point, you said a couple of minutes ago about the security. Take away conspiracy or no conspiracy, the fact that up until 1963, a president could be in an open motorcade like that.
And mind you, people, Abraham Lincoln was obviously, someone came up behind him in a theater at the end of a war and shot him in the head. And then McKinley was killed in 1901.
Yeah.
And Roosevelt was nearly killed in Chicago.
So it's mind blowing that it took something like that to create the way that the Secret Service does things now. But back then, it seemed to be
McKinley. The fact that McKinley was killed in 1900, you had 2 presidents killed in 35 years.
Yeah,
Lincoln and McKinley. Kind of surprising. So such little security.
And then seeing how history. It is so fluid, and how a bad guy can become a good guy and a good guy can become a bad guy. With Bobby Kennedy, when by 1968, 5 years later, he, as liberal as Kennedy was, or John F. Kennedy was, the Kennedy family was still pretty. They were conservative.
They're one of the richest families in the country.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, by 1968, Bobby was like, at least who his support was coming from, were like full-on hippies.
Oh yeah.
I mean, he had done a kind of an about face with some of his hard line, issues towards things, and had really softened. I think from everything I've read, he went into a deep depression after his brother died because he blamed himself, and it makes sense.
I think that there were people that wanted Kennedy dead, that probably, like, there's people who want every president dead. And Oswald was a flake the U.S. government, well, somebody in the CIA military kept him as an asset, said this guy, he's a marksman, he was a Marine, he could be useful to do something to somebody, because that's what they do. They keep all these assets, they're called. So if you're a CIA asset, you won't even know it, right? I meet some woman who gets me in a love affair just in case I could be turned. They want to do some propaganda through YouTube. They got her to guide me. Maybe I never get used.
Look what happened with Kennedy. The KGB had a female spy having an affair with Kennedy.
Oh yeah, it was. Well, the more frightening possibility. I mean, I don't discount that the Soviets could have been a part of it, but they would have definitely had to see. That points to the extreme cover-up, because that would have, the American public would have almost demanded World War III.
Weren't there two different? I should have researched this before I jumped on live, or not live, but on our recording. Warren Commission comes out and says single shooter, but then wasn't there another report that was released that said, no, we don't think it was a single shooter?
Yes. I don't know what it was called, but yeah,
two different reports. The more famous Warren Commission,
the official real one, yeah,
right. And then Bobby Kennedy's killed in '68. I still really have very little understanding of that. And
that's I don't know enough about that to talk about it. I mean,
no, I don't.
There's a lot of crazy people that want to feel important, and I mean, just for me being Al Prophet, just the stuff people say to you on YouTube, like there's people obsessed with me.
No, yeah,
much less someone like that. And if you kill a president, I mean, you are important.
I mean, just to wrap it up, my personal theory is that the mafia was, most likely behind this. They felt like they were buying.
So you're saying they were the guiding force. It wasn't U.S. No, it wasn't an element of U.S. intelligence.
I think it was the CIA and the mafia working together as a offshoot of their relationship.
And what did the CIA? What did whoever was controlling those CIA agents? What was their goal? Why?
So I think that there was a lot of worry that Kennedy, after what happened in the Bay of Pigs, not worry. I think it was accepted fact that he did not trust his military advisors.
Because he kind of ended the CIA, like he because he said, "Oh, you did such a bad job." The CIA was kind of put on ice, right?
So I feel like the military-industrial complex was worried that he was gonna not go all in on Vietnam and not do what they wanted him to do in regards to Castro and the Cold War. They were already in bed with the Italians. The Italians had their own reasons to want to get rid of him. And they, the mob thought they were buying a president. In reality, they put in an enemy in the White House that immediately, once he got in, came after him.
What about the personal angle of just Marcello so upset that he was deported?
No, and then there's no question those personal feelings play a role in it with all of these guys. With Hoffa, don't even though Hoffa was not a mobster per se, he, for all intents and purposes, he was, and he was a guy that had a lot of influence and say, and he had a ton of personal animus against the Kennedys, and he's in the ears of guys like Trafficante and Marcello, not to mention the guys up in Detroit and Chicago, and then so this was fun, man. Thank you, Al, for joining us. Break down the Kennedys and the Mafia 60-year anniversary of the JFK assassination. We both are of the opinion that the mob most likely played a role in the
It wasn't just Lee Harvey Oswald randomly doing it.
So, I enjoy these, getting back on the same page with Al. We started together, made our bones together. He's out, he's repping Gangster Report OG West Coast, and we're keeping it real here in the Midwest. Al, tell them where people can get everything from you.
YouTube.com/Al Prophet. Also, American Dope has some merch. And Scott, I'm going to be, me and my dad going to England the 19th, but I'll be there about the 9th.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'll be coming to Detroit around the 9th.
We'll do some.
So let's do some stuff.
We'll do some content for the channel for both of ours.
Yeah, let's do some Chaldean stuff.
Yes, we're teasing it.
I want to go to that store in Oak Park where the bath party killed somebody.
Yeah, we're going to tease it. Iraqi Mafia coming at you soon. For Al Prophet, for Benny Behind the Glass, OG Pod, out.